How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to Since 33. I hope you guys are having a fantastic day. I am not in my usual environment for recording. I'm traveling right now, but this will do. Today, I'm going to be talking about the Immaculate Conception of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Specifically, I wanted to make a stream, not so much a video, kind of going over the details about the theological details of this dogma. Um, Several Catholics have some questions about it, and even Protestants and Orthodox, whenever they're commenting on it all the time, they kind of seem to misunderstand some important points. So this won't be extremely in depth. It kind of will touch on some points that not your average layman will know about. But it would just be very basic theological explanation. I'm sure plenty of people will learn something new either way. So, I mean, we'll get right into it. Just be sure to like the stream if you're watching. If you're not subscribed, subscribe. Leave a comment below. I'll take questions at the end. And if you'd like to support me with a super chat, that is always welcome. Okay. So let me present my screen, share screen. And if you hear things in the background, it's just family, for the holidays and stuff. All right. So slideshow, view slideshow. There we go. Okay. Awesome. All right. So you guys see my screen. Perfect. Okay. So I'll just read off from and you guys should see that, right? Perfect. So Pope Blessed Pius IX, and by the way, I published an article today on my Substack. I'll show it at the end, but it's basically the case for St. Augustine teaching the Immaculate Conception. Everyone's pretty much aware. Most people are aware of whether or not, the debate surrounding St. Thomas Aquinas and whether he taught and held to the Immaculate Conception or not. But very few people are aware of the debate regarding St. Augustine of Hippo. I think there's a very good case to be made for him, and I personally hold that he did hold to it, or at least some very similar mode of it, where Mary might have been sanctified at some point in the womb. But regardless, we'll get into it. So Pope Blessed Pius IX, he published whatever. He defined the Immaculate Conception of Mary. He promulgated it as dogma in his bull Ineffabilis Deus, or Ineffable God, in the year 1854. And the real definition itself, after the long document preparing for the definition, it says, quote, "The most blessed Virgin Mary, in the first instance of her conception, by a singular grace and privilege granted by Almighty God, in view of the merits of Jesus Christ, the Savior of the human race, was preserved free from all stain of original sin." Okay, so now I'm just going to break down what that means, right? Before that, what this video is going to be, right, this live stream, I'm not going to be defending the dogma. I'm not going to be going over the history of the dogma or its controversy, and I won't be going over the development of doctrine. I won't be going over a lot of stuff that I could go into, so don't expect that. For example, if you have certain objections that you like, oh, what about this? You didn't talk about this. It's like not exactly the point of this live stream. Just explaining the dogma, not even defending it, just explaining it. So first, it says Mary in the first instance of her conception, right? So this is important, right? Here, let me get this out of the. This is kind of distracting a lot of people. I know it is. Some junk in the background. All right. So let me see. So it says Mary in the first instance of her conception, right? So I can put the slide back up, whatever. But we have to understand that that's talking about Our Lady's theological conception, not her biological conception, right? And what is the difference? Well, her theological conception is exactly when the person of Mary was constituted, right? When her body was united to her soul. And so you have a human person, properly speaking. Her biological conception would just be the moment that her flesh, her, I guess, future body, was conceived by her parents, right? After the marital act, after sperm and egg join. The reason this matters is because you do have people who hold to, and really throughout church history, plenty of theologians held to this. St. Augustine held to this. I'm pretty certain. St. Thomas Aquinas, several medievals, a very dominant view was that they believed in delayed ensoulment, right, or delayed animation, which means that the flesh of the person would be conceived before God would infuse the rational soul and unite it to the flesh for a certain time period in the womb, right? So you wouldn't actually have a human person for a while, full human person in the womb until some time, right? So why does that matter? Well, if you hold to instantaneous ensoulment, right? Or is that the official name for the position, right? If you hold that the soul is created by God the second that, or the instant really that the flesh is conceived, then the biological conception and the theological conception, right? I'll put those terms back up on the screen. They're not going to differ in logical or temporal. Well, I guess they kind of would differ logically, maybe, yeah, but they wouldn't differ in temporal. Uh, oh, thanks for the super chat. When will we see your first video in Spanish? I'm gonna pray on it, see if I want to make a Spanish channel, but if I do, it'll be sometime. I'll start it in January or something. So yeah, if you hold to like instantaneous ensoulment, right, then the theological and biological conception would happen at the exact same instance. Because not only is the flesh conceived, but also the soul is united to it immediately. But if you hold to delayed ensoulment, then you can actually hold that. I mean, and I definitely do hold that Mary's flesh, before it was united to her body, actually had concupiscence, right? Because her parents had, took part in the marital act and stained it with concupiscence. But we'll get more into that later. But that's important, right? We're talking about Mary's theological conception, not merely the conception of her flesh. In other words, when her soul was united to her body, that is when the Immaculate Conception happened. So the next thing is by a singular grace and privilege. That just means she alone from the children of Adam received this privilege. So like Abraham didn't receive this, right? Like King David didn't receive this. You get really close with like Saint John the Baptist, right? But he was actually sanctified in the womb after his conception, so he actually did inherit original sin. But he was sanctified from it later on. It says, in view of the merits of Jesus Christ. So this would just be, obviously, Christ is the meritorious cause for this. Nothing too complicated. And finally, preserved free from all stain of original sin. So from the moment that her soul was united to her body, right, at her theological conception, she was always adorned with sanctifying grace in her soul. So this is important because this actually doesn't properly speak directly to whether Mary had the fomes peccati or concupiscence as much. It's a related and connected question, but directly we're talking about the stain of the stain of original sin on the person's soul. That's what Mary did not have. But before going into it, I can just continue and we'll get into it later. There are theologians who want to expand this, who will read this and expand it to mean also absolutely no concupiscence. I don't hold that view. You're not required to hold that view, but certain theologians do hold to that. We'll get into that later. So really what's most important, and a lot of people are not aware of this, especially onlookers who aren't in the Catholic Church, but still may be interested, is the debitum debate, right? So the reason that this comes about is because we have to uphold two truths, right? Primarily and most importantly, Mary was redeemed by Christ. We know that Christ is the redeemer of all men, okay? Everyone who is saved by Christ. They're redeemed by Christ. And on the other hand, we also have to uphold that, and I don't know if I said thank you, but thank you for the super chat. I know I brought it up, but I don't know if I said thank you. So thank you for the super chat, man. Appreciate it. Fook Lee, I think that's how you pronounce it, right? Remind me, your name was Josh, right? I think it was. Anyway, we have to uphold that Mary was redeemed by Christ, and we also have to uphold that Mary was a fitting mother for the divine logos, right? And she had no association with the devil. Again, I'm not going to try to like prove it here from scripture or tradition or whatever right now, but generally speaking, that is the Catholic principle, right? That Mary had no association with Satan, that she was as fitting as a mother as fitting as a mother of God that she could be, right? God prepared her for that and made her, gave her the dignity for that, to bear Christ. And so we have to synthesize these two things, right? Therefore, she had a debitum in Latin to incur original sin, but was exempted from it. Okay, so we could speak less properly. We could say Mary should have, or Mary would have inherited the stain of original sin, or contracted the stain of original sin, incurred it, however you want to say it. She would have done so had she not been preserved from it. Okay. And I just put a nice little verse from Esther 15, which in the spiritual sense, many take this to be speaking about the Immaculate Conception. Not absolute proof by any means, but we know that Esther is like a what is it, like a type of Mary, right? She's a figure of Mary, and so it says, "Thou shalt not die, for this law is not made for thee, but for all others." So let's get into that a little more. We could talk about, there are three types of debts or debitums, right? That theologians speak about. There is the proximate debt, which is held by Thomists and other theologians. I'm not really well versed in like which school holds to what exactly. I know for sure the Thomistic position is that Mary had a proximate debt to incur original sin. You have the remote debt, which is like I've seen certain Jesuits hold it, but I can't really assign it to a school specifically off the top of my head. A lot of Jesuits tend to be a little more eclectic on stuff like this, but I definitely see some Jesuits hold to it. I can't say confidently that all of them hold to this by any means. I don't think that's true. And then there's the position that there's no debt at all, which seems very controversial at first, but I think there's a lot of there's a spark of beauty in it if contemplated well. We'll get into that a little later, into what that actually means, right? And this is typically held by Franciscans, Scotists, who hold to the absolute primacy of Jesus Christ. But we'll get into that later. I don't want to get ahead of myself. So the proximate debt, right, summarizing it, would mean that Mary was subject to the law, but the law was not applied to her. The remote debt of original sin would mean that Our Lady was not even subject to the law. And no debt would mean that Mary is outside the order of sin and thus did not have a debt at all. And I forgot to put punctuation there. So we can consider, and this is important, right? We can consider our union with our union with Adam as either a physical union or a moral union. The moral union would be that Christ is our legal representative and our head of the human race, and our physical union with him is that we inherit stained flesh from him, right? He is our biological father. This will come into play a little bit later. But I just summarized the different types of debts. Remember, if you guys have questions, go ahead. Yeah, exactly. Good point. Yeah, exactly. Like I said, the no debt position is only plausible in light of the absolute primacy of Christ. I don't see how you could. Yeah, it's really. I was thinking about this earlier today. Just kind of walking around the supermarket. I was just thinking about this. I'm like, yeah, there's really. It's all interconnected. If you hold to the absolute primacy of Christ, I could absolutely see. Like, I think the no debt position is it like sounds almost very problematic unless you hold to the position of the absolute primacy of Christ, and you're like you have a superlapsarian Christology. Then that would make more sense and doesn't seem so bizarre. But yeah, okay. So yeah, if you guys have questions, go ahead and send them, guys. I'll answer them at the end about preferably the Immaculate Conception of Mary, but anything else you have. Just so you know, I will be releasing a video kind of like defending the Immaculate Conception of Mary on Monday, on the feast day, from Scripture. I think it's going to be a very good video. Hopefully, I mean, my Assumption video did very well. It's my most viewed video on my channel right now. But hopefully it does very well too. I hope so. Last time I posted a video on the Immaculate Conception, it didn't do very well. So, but just be ready for that on Monday. And yeah, guys, leave your questions and I'll get to them at the end. Oh, so Nicholas Wiggett says, what does the absolute primacy of Christ mean? So it basically means that Christ is primary or first in God's logical decree of predestination, right? So that means basically that it basically means you're superlapsarian with Christology. So so the logical order that this would work in God's infinite decree would be that he decreed the incarnation first above all things, and that's why he made the world, and that's why he made Adam and Eve, and so the whole world was made for Christ. He always intended, whereas infralapsarian Christology would mean that Christ's incarnation is conditioned on the fall, right? Infra means in light of the fall, he became man to save us, which is like the Augustinian or Thomistic position. I hold to the infralapsarian position more I haven't really spent too much time reading about the arguments for both. And really, I think this is more of a topic that should be meditated on. I mean, you can read a lot about it, but this is something very deep. My friends and I were talking about this, and it's like, this is actually has a lot of potential to really influence your spiritual life, actually. The way you see God, the way you see Jesus Christ, and then the way you see Mary. This is huge. So what that means, right, is that if you believe in the absolute primacy of Christ, if you believe in superlapsarian Christology, which means that Christ was going to become man, regardless of whether man fell or not, whether Adam and Eve sinned or not. In other words, he was going to become man regardless of the fall. Yeah. That means that Mary was also going to exist and be created by God, regardless of whether the fall exists or not. Because if you have an infralapsarian Christology, then Christ is conditional. Mary is also conditional. Mary is not absolutely necessary. But if you believe in the primacy of Christ, then Mary is no longer conditioned. She is she is basically decreed right after Christ. She is the second being decreed. Like if God is going to decree, I'm going a little slow today. I'm kind of have a lot of thoughts going on through my head right now. But if God is going to decree the incarnation first, what comes immediately after is how that incarnation is going to come about, which is the Virgin Mary. Which is, again, it's really going to affect the way you pray, the way you see God, the way you see Christ, the Virgin Mary, which is very beautiful. I don't particularly hold to it just because I'm like, by default, I'm like, I hold to whatever the Thomists hold, but I am open to it, I guess. Yeah, this is a very good question. Anyway, sorry, Nicholas, I hope that answers your question. What the absolute primacy of Christ means. And so really the reason that actually makes the no debt position easier to accept is because, okay, Mary was always decreed to be in her own separate order with Christ and never really in the order of humanity. So, okay, so this is Albertus Young says, what is the real difference between points 2 and 3? I do not see remote debt and no debt. How remote debt and no debt differ? Great question. This is actually very hard for me to see at first too. I'll give some examples at the end, so just stick around to the end, and hopefully it'll be clear. If you still have questions after that, just ask again, because I'm going to pretty much answer it. Okay, with an example I'm going to give. Okay, so we'll keep going. So the proximate debt, right? It means that incurring original sin is caused by carnal propagation, because concupiscence is the material cause of original sin. So as St. Augustine says in Contra Julian, book 5, chapter 4, St. Augustine says that the soul is corrupted in the body as in a faulty vessel, right? So the way that this works, and I really don't need slides for this. The way this works is that, right, you have two parents who have flesh stained. So really, we can go all the way back to Adam and Eve, right? Adam and Eve were created immaculate, not only in their soul, but also in their flesh. They didn't have sinful concupiscence. They didn't have sinful passions. But after they sinned, they disordered themselves, not only stained their souls and incurred the guilt of mortal sin, but also their flesh, right, became flesh of sin. So now it actually waged war against the spirit, right? And now once they had their first children, once they had their children, they passed on the same flesh, right? Because the material of your flesh comes from your parents. The same flesh that is stained with concupiscence to their children. So when the soul is united, the flesh to the soul. So when the flesh is united to the flesh is united to the soul, it actually stains, right, the soul, so that it's unable to receive sanctifying grace, because it's like a contrary form to the form of sanctifying grace in your soul, pretty much. Remember, like think of it like two opposing forces, right? If you're in a state of grace, even if you're in a state of grace, concupiscence is still warring against your spirit, and it kind of pulls against the what charity and faith are ordered towards, right? If you allow those motions of concupiscence to actually prevail over you, you commit a sin. You commit a mortal sin, really, if it's a grave matter. And so those two are totally opposed to one another. The reason that you don't like automatically lose your state of grace is because you don't allow it to, right? When your spirit resists the motions of the flesh, so that the form that the flesh wants to impose on the soul does not actually take it over. That's what St. Augustine says, right? That's basically St. Paul's teaching in Romans, pretty much like from Romans 7 to 8, early 8, right? Like the beginning of chapter 8, but all of 7 pretty much. And so, but at conception, the flesh stains the soul because of the form that it imposes on it. It's contrary to sanctifying grace. Sanctifying grace orders you to God. Concupiscence wants to disorder you away from God, right? They're like two total polar opposites, right? Sinful concupiscence, not just any general passion. So if that's what you hold to, the way that if that's how you hold that original sin is propagated, then you're going to have a proximate debt. because not only are you in a moral union with Adam, but also a physical one. And so the very person of Mary would have had this debt herself. So Father Juniper Carroll says. So by the way, that's why I quoted Saint Augustine. Right? Saint Augustine is weird because he's a weird example because he actually, from what I can tell, I'm not as well read on this point on Saint Augustine, but he goes between creationism and traducianism. For those who don't know, creationism is the position that the soul is created by God immediately. Traducianism is the position that the soul is created basically just how the flesh of the child of the offspring comes from the two parents, so does the soul, right, come from the parents. And it's not immediately created by God. It's obviously everything's created by God, but not immediately. Saint Augustine, from throughout like a lot of his writings, at least, he's like undecided. He's like, well, it might just be created by God and creationism, or it might come from the parent itself. But if it is created by God, which is what we hold to now, he says that the soul is corrupted in the body as in a faulty vessel. So imagine you pour water into like a dirty cup, right? And then the water gets dirty itself. The liquid inside the cup, the dirty cup, is also gets dirty. That is pretty much how Saint Augustine would see when he does affirm creationism. That is how he would see the propagation of original sin, right? The soul is being stained by the flesh. So according to this view, says Juniper Carroll, well, not Father Juniper Carroll, but the whatever theologian was writing this chapter, because his work on Mariology is really just a compilation of other theologians like contributing. But anyway, in Father Carroll's Mariology Volume 1, he says, according to this view, the preservation of the Blessed Virgin was accomplished not by excluding her from the law of the transmission of original justice, which was a universal law without exception, but from the application of the law, right? So the law was not actually applied to Mary, even though she was subject to it. So that doesn't make a lot of sense. I'll get to better examples later. I promise you the examples are going to make a lot more sense. I promise you they will. Just be patient. Okay, you have the remote debt, which means that carnal generation from two parents is merely a conditio sine qua non. Original sin is propagated, but not the cause. So that sinful flesh, right, that St. Augustine talks about, that flesh stained with carnal concupiscence, is not actually the cause of you inheriting original sin, but because that is what is propagated from the sexual act, the marital act. It's simply a condition, right? That obviously, like if your parents don't engage in the marital act, you're not going to be conceived, right? That's merely the condition by which original sin is propagated, but not the cause. Really, the cause would just be the fact that you're only the moral union with Adam as your head, as your legal head in the human race. That would be the only reason that you don't inherit his gifts, not because the flesh has any sort of cause. It's not imposing any like contrary form on your soul. And Father Carroll, or his volume says, in the opinion favoring a remote debt in the Virgin Mary was entirely exempted from the universal law of original sin because the law was never intended for her. So this would simply mean that Mary obviously is still she's still, in a sense, morally united to Adam. But the law itself actually excludes an exception for her, not in its application, but merely in subjection. Again, very niche, very like, are we like splitting hairs here? It'll make more sense, I promise, in the examples I give at the end. Okay, and finally, there's a position that Mary had no debt, which means that Mary is decreed to be in a separate order altogether with Christ. She is neither subject to the law and exempted from it, she is neither subject to the law and exempted from its application, like in proximate debt position, nor is she exempted from the law itself, like in the remote debt position. In this case, in the position of no debt, which again is held like typically by Franciscans, maybe some Scotists. I don't want to say all Scotists because I'm not really sure, honestly. I'm not very good. I'm not well versed in like which particular schools, I'm confident in saying that the Thomists hold to the proximate debt, but other than that, I don't feel confident like laying down which school does what universally. Anyway, those who hold to the absolute primacy of Jesus Christ, they would say that the law is just irrelevant to her. There's no point in asking, is she exempt from the law or not? Just she's in her own separate order of decree from God, right? She was predestined solely for the sake of Christ, despite her coming from carnal generation. So she would still come from two human parents. But regardless, it's just that's just the means by which God chose to bring her into the world. But it's not even that she's not. It's not even that she's exempted from the law. There's just no law at all relevant to her. Okay, so go ahead and keep sending questions, guys. If you're watching, go ahead and leave a like on the video, comment below in the live chat, in the regular chat. Really helps out. More people can see this. This is very good content. I'll have some further reading section at the end, but this is very good stuff. I'm sure this is going to be helpful for a lot of people, so go ahead and share it with others. Okay, so this is the analogy that I chose to use. I chose to use two. I have another slide after this. So I think it was who was asking. So let me see. So Albertus Young asked, what is the difference between points 2 and 3? This is for you, my man. Okay, this is for you. So this is a train analogy, right? In the proximate debt, right? Mary would be on the track, right? Like the train's coming, right? The train is, Satan, right? And he's the serpent, right? He's biting every single offspring of Adam with his venom and, infecting them with original sin, right? And Mary's on the track, on this train track, right? And so that would mean she's like subject to the law, right? But as soon as the train is like about to reach her, God intervenes and actually halts the train before it reaches her. So Mary is not, bitten by the devil, the serpent, right? She's not ran over by the train, you might say. This would be the proximate deposition. She is redeemed, she is saved, because even though she was on the train tracks, God stopped the train from hitting her, right? In the remote deposition, Mary would never be on the train track in the first place. She's connected to the track, like she belongs to the human race of people who would be on the track, right? But God decides from the start to not even place her on it. So the train runs, but she is not on the train on the train track as it travels, right? And finally, and I know these are like very niche, like, well, who cares, right? Well, theologians care, okay? Theologians care. I think at least for the third position of no debt, I think this actually would really influence your spiritual life in a positive way. One day we'll get to heaven and we'll understand, we'll actually see this, and we'll actually be like, oh, the Thomists were right all along, like with all things. But it's still very beautiful to meditate on this. It might be, maybe it's false. Maybe we get to heaven and it's true. Maybe we get to heaven and it's false. Who knows? There's a lot of speculation here, right? And I think there's good arguments for both positions. I could see from scripture, I can definitely see both positions. But anyway, the note that position would mean that Mary's just on a totally different railway altogether. She's not even like standing in front of the railway. She's just in a whole different rail system designed by Christ, right? The track where the train runs is not her track at all. So the train is completely irrelevant to her order. So she's not like on the train track and then like God stops the train before it reaches her. She's not standing beside the train track, and the train was never going to hit her because she was never supposed to be on the train track. But rather, she's just like not even in this context at all. She's in her own separate order with Christ, right? Which is very beautiful. I'll digress for a second, right? I think there is actually some biblical support for this. There's this, and I'll bring this up in my video on Monday. You'll see it in my video on Monday. No, there's no like clear proof, right? But Mary, the person of Mary, is presented as someone who is always united to the mission of Christ, right? And I would argue you can make a good case that she is in her own separate order. You see this in Genesis 3:15. I'll bring this up in my video on Monday, right? The woman and her seed are like separated by God from the devil and his seed, right? His seed could either mean sinners or the kingdom of sin, right? Regardless what devil and his seed mean, or the serpent's obviously the devil, but regardless what the serpent's seed means, the woman here is with Christ, not with the devil. She's in her own, you could say she's in her own order, right? Then you get to, the Gospel of Luke, right? Blessed are thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb, right? So now Mary is blessed just as Jesus is blessed, right? They're like kind of put next to each other there. What I really like is John chapter 2, because John chapter 2, they're in the wedding feast, right? Very early on, just like in the book of Genesis, very early on, you have the wedding between Adam and Eve, right? And we know that Mary's the new Eve. So when Mary says, "Oh, they're out of wine," in the original Greek, Jesus says, "Well, what is that to you and to me, or to me and to you?" Right? Like, what do we have to do with them? Right? Which actually, there's a sermon in the 5th century that maybe like late 5th century or early 6th century. It's impossible to really tell where the manuscript dates to, but it's around that time period, 400s or 500s. There's a sermon from the early church that it's an anonymous author. It was attributed to St. Augustine. I made a video, a live stream on this, that basically says that, yeah, like Mary and Christ were invited to this wedding, and this wedding represents, sinful humanity celebrating how like all of humanity is like married to the devil. But Mary is present there at the wedding only because she's a human being, only because she's part of the human race, not because she actually belongs to the devil, because she doesn't have the sin of the human race. So like when Christ says, what is that to you and to me, there's like a mystical higher meaning there of like, we are on our own. And obviously this obviously is due to the grace of Christ. Mary's not like a deity or anything like that. That doesn't even have to be said, but because it's just obvious. But my point is, when you study scripture and you read the way that Mary's talked about, right? Like she is grouped with Christ constantly, right? She is like, you ever seen those old movies where you have like, I don't know what they're called. Maybe you guys can let me know in the comments. You ever seen those like motorcycles that have like a passenger seat next to them, right? That's kind of how like Mary's portrayed, right? Like Christ is obviously the main driver. He's the redeemer. He does absolutely 100% of the work, but he always brings his mother along to like share in the glory of it. Not the same glory as Christ, whatever. I'm not a idolater, but I'm saying like he like always like brings her along, right, in the work of redemption. That is how scripture presents her. So I think there's a good case to be made for Mary being in her own separate order. But again, it's just speculation. There's nothing certain we can really say here. The other analogy I gave was civil law. This one will be a little more this one will be a little better to understand, right? You have so in the proximate deposition, Mary would be covered by the law and owes the penalty, but the government steps in and cancels it before it takes effect. In the remote deposition, Mary is a citizen who would normally be covered, but the law is written with a special exemption stating it does not apply to her, right? So like in the proximate deposition, the law would say like all citizens, right? And they're like punishing each citizen. And then right as they're about to get to Mary, the government's like, no, not her, right? In the remote deposition, the law explicitly says every citizen except Mary, right? Because she's still part of that. She's still a citizen in that city. And the no deposition would mean that Mary isn't even in the legal system that the law governs at all. She belongs to a different jurisdiction, so the law is simply irrelevant to her. I think that explains it a little bit better. What's the difference between a remote debt and no debt? I understand they're very similar and they're kind of hard to understand. And really, this is just theological speculation, but that's what the stream is for. So I kind of forgot what I have next, honestly. Who knows? Okay, so actually, this is important. So did Mary have concupiscence? This is not extremely related to, this is not extremely, this is such a bad word, inaccurate word. This is not directly related to it. Well, it kind of is, whatever. It's not essentially what the Immaculate Conception is, right? But it's important, right? Because you definitely have to hold. I'm not sure, actually, if Michael's in the chat. Michael, are you still in the chat? What's the theological note on Mary and having concupiscence in first act? Like, I know at least all theologians reject it. That's for sure. Concupiscence in first act, I know that they're all rejected, but it's definitely not. Is it close to faith? Is it proximate to the faith, or is it just a probable conclusion? What's the theological note on that? I was in a rush. I wasn't able to search for it before this. But anyway, so did Mary have concupiscence? So before animation, before the soul was united to her flesh, definitely did hold to it. I'll quote Father Soul later, but what we're really asking here is after animation, right? After animation, did she we can also call concupiscence the fomes peccati, or the tinder right for sin, right? Think of it like basically think of like sin or like concupiscence, right? Like this flame, right? That's like kind of living there in your flesh. And you ever seen like a fire that like starts acting up and like rises up, because you like throw a lot of wood in it? That would be like motions of concupiscence, right? If you let them touch you and burn you, like that would be an actual sin, right? So the fomes peccati in first act would mean that she actually has this in essence, but it's always bound, right? Either by internal or external circumstances. That's not really relevant right now. This would be the position, for example, of like St. Thomas Aquinas. I think there's a case to be made that St. Augustine held to this, but I'm not really certain about it. But this would mean that basically her flesh is not absolutely purified. Now, why would this be the case, right? Because remember what I said. The form that concupiscence, right, is ordered towards, right, is contrary to the form that sanctifying grace gives the soul. Okay, so basically, because they're like two opposites, right? The spirit lusts against the flesh, and the flesh lusts against the spirit. The greater holiness that somebody has, the more that they live a meritorious life, the more they grow in charity. That's obviously also going to be opposed to concupiscence. That's why you fast. That's why you deny yourself. That's why you pray more, right? In order to subdue, right, and dominate your own flesh, so that concupiscence no longer, slowly but surely, by the grace of God, uh, rises against you, less and less, less and less, right? You basically, it's think of it like a vessel, right? Like you can either fill it with like pure water, like sanctifying grace, or like oil, petroleum, right? Like the more water you put in, right, eventually the petroleum's gonna start, going. Actually, is there like a, because I know like water and oil don't mix, right? But like the petroleum and water mix, whatever. Let's say you have like soda and water, right? The more you pour water, you have let's say you have like a faucet just like pouring down water. And you have soda, right? It's like the water's going to replace the soda eventually. That's pretty much how you should imagine this, right? So the greater you are in holiness, the more you're gonna. That's why monks, right? That's why they probably only commit like venial sins or something, right? Because they have totally subdued their body and let sanctifying grace totally transform them, right? On the contrary, right? If you let that, if you allow the flesh to win, then you commit a mortal sin, which totally blots out sanctifying grace from the soul. So if Mary's going to have, why does this matter, right? Why am I saying this? Why am I yapping about this? If Mary's going to have no concupiscence, right, or maybe some concupiscence in first act, but not in second act, we're only asking the question of how much sanctifying grace did she receive in her conception, right? Was it enough to just put her in a state of grace? Was it a little more, or was it enough to really totally extinguish concupiscence, or only bind it, right? Only restrain it. The Thomistic position is that, and this is in line with the Church Fathers, because the Church Fathers speak about Mary being purified at the Annunciation, right? Her flesh being purified. They don't speak about this universally. I know there are different fathers that say things differently. I am well aware of what they say, but generally a lot of them speak about her flesh being purified. This isn't against the Immaculate Conception at all when they speak in this particular way. If they say something like Mary, her soul had to be purified from sins, it's like, yeah, you really can't square that with the Immaculate Conception. And I think there's like one or two fathers that I've found who say that, and they're just wrong. But when they speak of her flesh being purified, this is perfectly normal and perfectly fine to accept, right? It would only mean that her flesh is purified from that fomes peccati. In other words, her soul is increasing in holiness and charity, so as to perfectly subdue her flesh to her soul, right? So she can be rightly ordered and perfectly in line with reason. That a lot of Protestants, a lot of Orthodox will quote Church Fathers all the time saying like, oh, this father says that her flesh had to be purified, so he's denying her Immaculate Conception. Like, no, right? The Thomistic position, which is what I hold to, is that Mary at her in the womb, in her conception, whatever, did St. Thomas hold to it? Who knows? But in the womb, in her first sanctification, right, she was cleansed of concupiscence, so only the concupiscence in first act remained, right? Think of it like a small little flame that's just there, but it's not like rising flames up that can almost burn you, right? Whereas in second act, it would mean that these flames are actually rising up and producing motions of sin, right? The example that my friend Michael gave me, which is pretty good, is like, okay, well, if Mary had concupiscence in first act, then that would mean that she still had passions besides reason, right? But never against reason. If she still had concupiscence in second act, like we all do, right? It would mean that Mary had experienced passions. She didn't consent to them because she didn't sin against reason, right? So, like, for example, you're eating. This is the example that my friend Michael gave me. You're eating and you're like, you want to commit gluttony, right? Whereas besides reason would mean that Mary didn't commit. She didn't feel like moved to commit gluttony, but like she ate until she was full, until she felt full, which is besides reason. And having absolutely no fomes peccati, no concupiscence, would mean that Mary ate until her body was well nourished, which doesn't even mean that you need to feel full yet, right? So you can have passions perfectly ordered to reason, besides reason, or opposed to reason, right? If you believe in the Thomistic position, you believe that Mary was sanctified so that concupiscence was only bound but not absolutely extinguished in her, and so she would have had passions besides reason up until the Annunciation, and then her concupiscence was totally extinguished, right? By another a further infusion of sanctifying grace. So I know that's a lot of yapping. I'm sorry, but basically nobody holds that she had concupiscence in the second act, like that she never experienced sinful passions. I believe the Eastern Orthodox hold to this, which is kind of really weird. I'll make another video on this or another live stream eventually. But they usually the way they argue, I'd have to read more formal material on it rather than just like seeing how Craig Truglia or other Eastern Orthodox online guys argue about it, but usually their argument is that, like, well, if Mary never experienced concupiscence, then she wasn't, then nothing that she did was meritorious, which is, yeah, that's their argument. But like she had to actually feel these sinful passions in order to actually reject, like, so she could reject them, so she could actually like be like virtuous. Like, what? Okay, well, I'll get to that in another video. So I think that explains it well. I don't know. Yeah, this is what Father Maureen Sola says, right? Amazing Thomas. He says, quote, if the Blessed Virgin's body had been, am I sharing my screen? Yeah. If the Blessed Virgin's body had been preserved from all taint of original sin prior to the infusion of the soul, it seems clear that there would not be in her any debt, nor consequently any redemption by Jesus Christ, since the person is posterior in nature to the infusion of the soul. Now then, not only the simple faithful, but even the liturgical office itself of the Church of Lyons seem to affirm the purification of the Blessed Virgin's body prior to its animation. If this is true, St. Bernard and all the other doctors rendered a great service to the dogma by opposing the feast understood in such manner. So what does this mean? Right, we know that at least in the Thomistic position, concupiscence is the material cause of original sin. The stained flesh, right, as St. Augustine says, stains the soul. Like when you pour a liquid inside of a faulty vessel, a dirty vessel, right? You pour like clear water into a dirty vessel, the water is going to get dirty too, right? So if Mary's flesh had been conceived with absolutely zero concupiscence, right, then there would be no redemption in her, just like in Jesus Christ. That's why Mary had to be cleansed of her own concupiscence, whether, we're not talking about whether in first act or second act here, at least of concupiscence in second act, so that Christ wouldn't need to be redeemed, right? Because if Christ had taken, because remember, the cleansing of flesh occurs when God infuses grace into the soul, perfectly ordering the passions, and ordering your soul towards right reason, right? So really towards God, right? That happens in the infusion of sanctifying grace. The more sanctifying grace that God infuses, the more rightly ordered that you are. If God had done that to Jesus after his conception, he would be redeemed. That is blasphemous. You're saying that God needed to be redeemed. We don't say that about Jesus. Christ is the Redeemer. He's not the redeemed, right? He's not redeemed. He's the Redeemer, which means that that Mary's flesh, if you hold to the Thomistic position, the Augustinian position of how original sin is propagated, that would mean that Mary had to have an absolute, and I think that that's pretty much what St. Augustine says, that Mary would have had to have a stainless, right, flesh, or at least concupiscence only in first act, not in second act, so that Christ wouldn't have to be redeemed. So why does that matter, right? It matters because if you say that Mary did not have that before her animation, then she wasn't redeemed either, which is problematic because we have to hold that she's redeemed. So saying that her flesh was conceived with sinful concupiscence or whatever you want to call it, we probably wouldn't speak that way because it's still harsh language. It sounds weird, but it is what it is. Before her theological conception, that's perfectly fine. You're only affirming at least approximate depth there. So if there's further questions on this, please ask. I might miss something that I assume everybody else knows, but yeah. So I included this quote from St. Augustine because I can already hear people coping. They're like, well, this distinction between concupiscence in first act and second act, you're making this up. This is a later scholastic innovation, whatever. Actually, St. Augustine does talk about this. The distinction between concupiscence in first act and second act, where it's either bound, in first act it exists, but it's bound if you only have it in first act, or in second act, it actually rises up and wars against the spirit. St. Augustine actually at least acknowledges the existence of this, right? He says that in the garden, Adam, before he sinned, had neither the flesh of sin nor the likeness of the flesh of sin, because he would not have died unless he had sinned. But after he sinned, the flesh of sin begot flesh of sin. For by that carnal concupiscence he begot it. The concupiscence which before sin, so before Adam had sinned, right, either did not exist in him at all or did not resist the spirit. So notice what St. Augustine is saying. He's saying that before Adam sinned, he either did not the concupiscence either did not exist in him at all. In other words, he had concupiscence neither in second act or in first act, as we would later call it. He just didn't have it, right? He had a perfectly his flesh was perfectly subjugated to his spirit, to his soul, which was in a state of grace. Or if it did exist, right, then it at least did not resist the spirit. This would be concupiscence in second act, right? So this distinction is actually at least Augustinian, very clearly Augustinian. He acknowledges that these concupiscence, right, these desires, could actually exist, but not be, contrary to reason, contrary to the soul and sanctifying grace. or they could just not exist at all. That is a distinction that St. Augustine makes, not us later making this stuff up, right? So it's very interesting. Really, that's the only reason that, and notice how he says, Christ, who was not born by that concupiscence of the flesh, was born of not without sin. So Christ had absolutely no concupiscence, right? He was totally impeccable. He had absolutely, clean flesh, you could say. Okay, I didn't really make a slide for this. I didn't have time because time was coming up on me. But basically, I can talk about this for a bit. If you hold that concupiscence is transmitted, that concupiscence is the material cause, right, of original sin, the proximate cause of original sin, then Mary would have actually had to have, not only would she have had to have totally cleansed flesh, at least from concupiscence in second act, really in first act too for Christ, but you actually don't hold that a father is actually necessary, absolutely necessary for this. I mean, maybe it's not the right time to talk about it because I haven't read about this in a while, but basically, like, the Jesuit position is that original sin is transmitted by the father, right? By one man, sin came into the world. They literally take it to mean that only by Adam, and like the mother's flesh stained with concupiscence doesn't matter at all. So in that sense, right, the fact that Mary was a virgin, because some people would say, right, what am I yapping about here? Some theologians would say that the fact that Mary was a virgin and that she didn't conceive our Lord through normal means, through the marital act, that was sufficient for him to not inherit original sin, right? Because original sin, according to them, is only passed down by the father of the offspring, right? By the parent, the male parent, right? The father. Several Jesuits I've read, like Pesch, Father Joseph Pohl, who's not a Jesuit, properly speaking, but he subscribes to the weird positions of the Jesuits. And this tricked me up a lot. I actually contacted Christian Wagner about this because I was totally confused about this at first. Like, what are they saying? He's like, oh no, that's just their position, and some others, but like general, it's not the universal position, right? They would say that being a virgin mother is sufficient to not pass on original sin, whereas the Thomists, the Augustinians, would say like, no, at least following St. Augustine, there's like, no. Not only did did Jesus have to have no father, right? But concupiscence would have also stained the soul, and would have needed cleansing before animation or at animation, so that not only did Jesus have no father, but he would have also received original sin from his mother. Therefore, she needed cleansed. Does that make sense? I know that's a little tricky. I'm kind of yapping. I didn't make a slide for this, so I'm kind of disoriented. But the last slide, and I'll take questions now. The last slide is just for further reading material. Father Carroll, Mariology Volume 1 talks about this, but he has a total of 3 volumes. They're pretty good. Father Shaban, he talks about this in his Dogmatics, Volume 5.2. And someone also compiled that entire section into their own PDFs on Isidore. By the way, all of these you can just Google them. They're either on Internet Archive or Isidore.co, right? Someone compiled Father Shaban's Dogmatics into their own Mariology volumes. Those are easier to read, right? Because you don't have the whole big PDF pulled up, where he also talks about Christ, the Redeemer. And the Sacred Theologiae Summa, Volume 3a, the English translation, Kenneth Baker or Barker translation. Hope I got that name right. All these are either on Isidore.co or on Internet Archive. Great readings. Don't just take my word for it. Go do further reading yourself. And yeah, that is all for today. That is all I have. I know it's not a lot, but I think we went over some good information. So I'll take questions at this point. If you'd like to support me with super chats, I would really appreciate that, but obviously not mandatory, not required. I will nevertheless answer your question. And please, if you're watching and you haven't liked the stream, go ahead and like the stream, guys. It really helps me out a lot. And it helps other people see it. There's good information here. So yeah. So Francis says, how do you explain Mary losing Jesus at the temple? Jesus seemingly rebuking Mary at Cana. Why do you involve me? My hour has not yet come. And Jesus seemingly rebuke in Luke 22, 48, 49. Yeah. So I guess I'll answer the first one first. Mary losing Jesus in the temple. That's a good question. I mean, it's really is just she didn't lose him out of being an irresponsible parent. It's just they thought that he was with I'd have to read the passage. It's like other family members, right? And the traveling back with other, I think it says either other family members or other kin, but it's not. There's no real like exegetical basis for saying that she was like being irresponsible or negligent. Um, yeah. Says Jesus seemingly rebuking her at Cana. I mean, the original Greek says, what is that to you and to me? So he's really not even talking against her. He's like including her in his dialogue. He's really saying like, what does that have to do with us, like you and I? Not saying like, oh, stop bothering me or something like that. I don't think there's any evidence there's no basis. I know that church fathers or some commentators do read it as Christ rebuking her. I'm aware of that, but I would just say there's no exegetical basis for that. I don't think really. I mean, we all have our moments, I guess. I don't know. Yeah. And then his rebuke in Luke 2:48. What is Luke 2:48? Yeah, so his response to being found in the temple. Yeah, I would just say there's no exegetical basis to conclude here that this is actually a rebuke, like a rebuke against some sort of sin. What Mary did not have. So before the fall, right, Adam and Eve did not have to use reason. They had. Michael can comment on this a little better than I can if he's in the live chat. But after the fall, right, Mary did not inherit that preternatural gift of not having to use discursive reasoning. So she wasn't like all knowing. That's why it says very clearly like they did not understand at first what he was saying, right? He didn't inherit that gift from Adam and Eve, even though she inherited the gift of immortality from her bodily assumption, or at least being resurrected afterwards, or her gift from freedom from original sin on concupiscence and all that stuff. She didn't inherit her freedom of the freedom from ignorance in many things. So yeah, but actually, if you want a better response, Father Juniper Carroll actually answers this. I don't really remember, Francis, which volume he treats this in. I think it might be one, but it might be one, but I'm not sure. I forgot. So if you go check out Father Juniper Carroll's Mariology, check out either volume 1 or 2. Check volume 1 where it talks about Mary in the New Testament. I think that might be where he addresses there are commentators who have read this before in the past as rebukes or whatever, but he just talks about why they're not really a good point. So yeah. Hi, blessings. Okay, so Danielle or Daniel says, wedding at Cana, he can correct me, but the term woman is reference to woman being used as a shadow from Eve, meaning Mary is the new Eve. Yeah, I think that's basically what's going on there. I think that John he lived with Mary. He took her into his own home, and after decades of living with her, he basically, the way he wrote his gospel was very mystical, very sacramental. I think that's definitely what at least, even if it wasn't St. John's intention, I think it's definitely the Holy Spirit's intention. Yeah, I think that's a very beautiful point. I'll touch on that in my video. Thanks for the clear explanation. I find Thomism wrong on several important questions and prefer Scotism. Okay, good for you. That's I assume you're Catholic, so at least you're Catholic. That's good. Do you think that the Orthodox Catholic could ever have some harmony with original sin for future uniting, if ever possible? I don't know. I'd have to read more on what the official position is on the Eastern Orthodox. I've heard both. I've heard well, we rejected. We actually did not. We actually accepted this and that. Literally today, some Orthodox guy commented under one of my posts oh, the Roman Church or whatever, the Pope forced an innovative view of original sin on the West, and that's why we can. And then someone an Orthodox guy corrected him. He's like, dude, we agree with him on original sin. What are you saying? It's they don't even know. So I'd have to go read. I know there's official sources I can go read on their official stance on original sin. I'm not really sure. Sorry. But I mean, of course there can be. I mean, all things are possible with God, and we probably do already agree. It's just modern Orthodox bros. They're just a whole other they're a whole other order of predestination. They're just they're not even Orthobros are just their own thing. Okay, Orthodox. St. Thomas quotes, "For sin is either original, and from this she was cleansed in the womb, or mortem venial, from this she was free. Christ excelled the Blessed Virgin in this, that he was conceived and born without original sin, while the Blessed Virgin was conceived in original sin, but was born not born in it." Or you're asking if that's Orthodox? Yeah, so I'm not an expert on St. Thomas and whether or not he held the Immaculate Conception, but you can interpret this to just mean his biological conception, because he held to delayed ensoulment, right? As I explained earlier in the live. So absolutely, Christ could not have had a biological conception or a theological conception by that means, where his flesh was ever stained with concupiscence. Mary definitely could have, and I think she did. I believe she did. I think she kind of had to in order to actually have some sort of depth. So, if he's talking about original sin with regards to its matter, which is stained flesh with concupiscence, then yeah, that would be totally Orthodox. But now, if we read it as in like theological conception, in other words, when animation occurs, then no, it would say Mary actually did not incur the stain of original sin on her soul. Yeah, I know I yap a lot. Sorry about that, bro. Okay. The new studio. No, I hope to be back in my original recording space within like the month. Yeah, I'll go back pretty soon. So, but yeah, the videos I'm gonna record, I'm just not gonna record myself. It's just silly. I'm just gonna record my voice. That's it. Oh, Dr. Bustdown, I love having you here. If we found the rabbi with a table of contents in his pocket that dates to the time of Herod, king of the Jews, would this get Protestants around the problem of the fallible lisp of infallible Jews? No, it actually wouldn't get them around the problem because, hello. Do you think Protestants can one day find their own Shaban, someone who they can quote the majority agreement in RC, or even engage with the argument? I think I kind of understand your question. I don't know. The Protestantism is kind of dead, bro. I'm not saying that there doesn't exist later theologians who are as great at, like, our tradition just keeps getting better. I honestly like the responses to Protestantism that came from our authors in the 19th century way more than I like the responses to Protestantism that came from the counter reformers. Doesn't mean that they're not good, the counter reformers like St. Robert Bellarmine or anything, but I like, Father Shaban and Cardinal Franslin a lot more than I like, I haven't read Stapleton at all extensively. I've read like very little sections of him, so maybe I'm judging too soon. But like St. Robert Bellarmine, with regards to the rule of faith, at least the rule of faith, Shaban kills it. Father Cardinal Franslin kills it. And from what I've heard, the other members of the Schola Romana, I want to get to reading them pretty soon. The other members of the Schola Romana, they kill it as well. Okay. And what's funny, you know what's funny? Most of them are German. Most of them are German Jesuits. So, yeah, I think the 19th century is, whereas you can't really say that with Protestantism. Like, I think you peak in the 17th century and that's it. I think Protestantism peaked in this, from what I can tell, right? Like, that's why I still cite, that's why I'm citing Gerhard and Calovius or Baxter or whatever. It's like, I know that like good Orthodox traditional theologians exist after that. I get it. But they're not, from what I can tell. Maybe I'm totally wrong. Which wouldn't, I don't care. I'd love to know if I was wrong or not, but they're not as monumental as the earlier writers. Whereas our tradition just keeps like, oh, like we're getting better. So it is volume 1 where Father Carroll talks about why, Mary was not being rebuked. Yeah, good to know. So there's your answer, Francis. Go check volume 1. Simply put, Christ of the temple was reminding Mary of his divine mission. There is no moral rebuke at especially if you compare passages where our Lord condemns others for moral faults. Yep. Lady, from what it seems. What did you say? Oh. Okay. Have you ever read Canon Crossfire? No, what is that? Never heard of it. Help with family issues. What does that have to do with anything? Well, I'm all out of questions. So if you guys have no more questions about the Immaculate Conception, about Our Lady, I'm out. I want to thank again Fook Lee for the super chat. Thank you for the super chat. Helps a lot. Really appreciate it. Thank you, man. You're always sending super chats. It's really helpful. You know, if you guys want to take the burden off Fook Lee's back and be generous with super chats, that would help him a lot. By lady? Oh, really? Was it a lady? That's kind of funny. Couldn't tell. Okay. Well, I'm going to give you guys like 10 seconds. I'll talk about what's coming up. On Monday, I'm releasing a video for the Feast of Our Lady, Immaculate Conception. It's going to be a biblical defense, some patristics, whatever. Biblical and theological defense for the Immaculate Conception. It's going to be good. Give it a like. Watch it all the way through. Don't watch it and cut out because that harms, that harms the video with the algorithm. If you like watch halfway or if you watch like 5 seconds and you leave, dude, I'm cooked. My video is not going to get past like 2 views. Okay. So watch the video in full. Leave a like, comment, and you don't have to comment like, oh, general or what is it? Common Catholic win. Just like comment your thoughts below, really what you think. Ask questions. And I'll release that on Monday. I'll see if I can stream on Monday and do something else related to the Immaculate Conception. So my Substack. So I uploaded on my Substack today an article of St. Augustine and the Immaculate Conception, because I do believe that St. Augustine, the Doctor of Grace, held to the Immaculate Conception of the Blessed Virgin Mary. So if you go to my Substack, and you search, you just go to Substack, you search for my my username, you will find that I published this article here. And I also have a video version of it. This is basically just my script, honestly. This is just my script. But yeah, I go into very large detail about why, for the case of the Immaculate Conception in St. Augustine, which took a lot of reading and a lot of research to do a few months ago. So, okay. So, thanks equals, okay. Do you read St. Augustine or just quote mine? I mean, I do both, honestly. He's probably the church father whose works I read the most, like full works. But I'll sometimes quote mine him if I see him quoted in a secondary work. Really, I mean, it's kind of in between. Like, yeah, I'll read his full works, but I also don't just like quote mine. Like, if I want to use his quotes for something, I'll like read 3 chapters before and like 2 chapters after, a chapter after, whatever. Which I guess is still quote mining, but I'm actually reading the freaking context, right? And I'll do in-depth studies of how other authors, Catholic, Reformed, Lutheran, Anglican, are citing him on this passage. So I guess it's quote mining, but it's not just like copy paste. It's like I'm looking at the Latin. I'm looking at the Patrologia Latina from Minier. I'm looking at the CSEL critical edition. Like, I'm not just going on New Advent here and go copy pasting. Okay, I'm doing some serious work. Okay, I am a scholar in everything except title. Okay, I'm joking, but I'm not just going and copy pasting from New Advent. Okay, I'm actually doing research and stuff like that. But yeah, I'll occasionally read like his full works. I'm reading other stuff right now. I don't really have time to read St. Augustine right now. His full works. I used to read a lot more of his full works in the past, months ago and like years ago. But I think, to be frank with you, I think the last full work I read by St. Augustine was probably for my theology class, like a year ago. A little over a year ago, but about a year ago was probably the last time I had to read a full work from St. Augustine, honestly. Is Kevin going to feature me in the video? No. Do you just sit in the middle of the night reading his anti-Manichaean writings? No. It's on the Deuterocanon, and I just meant like Protestant family objections. Protestant families, I guess. Well, okay. Well, thank you guys for keeping me, for keeping me entertained, and thank you guys for watching. Like the video. Hey, if you're watching, you haven't liked the video. Yeah, I did. This is awesome clarification. This was awesome. Basically, wasn't it basically that like, oh, you can actually hold to the title, you just shouldn't be using it like liturgically or publicly, right? Um, yeah. Okay. Well, thank you guys for watching. Please leave a like if you guys enjoyed, and I hope you guys are having a blessed Advent. I will see you guys on Monday. Make sure to watch that video, like it, and I hope you guys have a great evening. God bless you guys.